Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from my hometown of Marshalltown, Iowa, where I'm visiting the rents for a few days. Today we are going to be talking about winter. It has been a really weird winter, specifically in Europe, over the course of the last few weeks. In the second and first weeks of January, temperatures have been and are expected to continue to be in the 50s in Paris, in the 40s in Berlin and Warsaw, and in the high 30s in places in Ukraine, most notably Kiev. Now, this is throwing a lot of my forecasts into a bit of a tailspin, but weather does what weather does. Temperatures are, based on where you are, somewhere between 20 and 40 degrees above normal and have been relatively consistently for almost a month at this point. In the case of Western Europe and Central Europe, this means that energy demand has plummeted, because normally these guys would be approaching 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and in those sorts of environments, they simply need to use a lot of energy in order to keep the lights on and especially the heat going. But there have been times that Berlin has broken 50 in December, and in that sort of environment, keeping everybody warm is really easy. And that means that energy demand has plummeted, and the need to cope with the cutoffs that have come from the Russian space because of the Ukraine war simply are very manageable. And in that sort of environment, you have to play it forward, because it's not just about electricity and heating. In the European space, they use a lot of natural gas for a lot of industrial needs. And when the war began and the Europeans began weaning themselves off of Russian energy, they discovered they had to shut down a whole lot of industry in order to keep people alive. Well, now, with the weather warmer and energy freed up for other uses, we're seeing everything from industry to specifically fertilizer production, nitrogen fertilizer production, coming back at scale. This is something that is wildly unexpected. This is the warmest winter on record by a very large margin. We shouldn't expect it to last. We shouldn't expect it to be repeated. But at least for this moment, Europe is having a great time of it. And considering the obstacles in front of them and the situation with energy supply in general, enjoy it while it lasts. The problem, of course, is its weather. It could change tomorrow. Probably will change within a couple of weeks. And then we're going to be back in the same place. The issue is that energy demand tends to be inelastic. And so if you only remove 5 to 10% of energy inputs, and with the Europeans, with the Russian stuff going offline, we're talking 40%, you can easily see a doubling, tripling, quadrupling, sextupling of energy prices like we saw consistently last year. But it also means that it goes the other direction as well. So you reduce demand by 10% and prices absolutely plummeted, and that's where we are today. Won't last. This is not the new normal. All the forecasts are still in place, but if we can hold warm weather throughout, say, January, then you can see the end of the winter on the other side, and we might get to a better position for the Europeans and for global food supplies this calendar year. And that would be unexpected, but very, very welcome. The other big weather thing is further east in Kiev, where temperatures are in the 30s. Now, normally, you have certain seasons that you can and cannot do things in Ukraine. You have your deep freeze in the winter, which is normally mid-November through late February, when temperatures have been so far below freezing for so long that the ground freezes solid and tanks can move around in fields just fine. But then you've got the shoulder seasons in October and early November, and then in March and into April that are kind of mud seasons. And in those sorts of environments, you can really only drive on roads. Well, my standing forecast for Ukraine is that the Ukrainians were going to try to do a broad spectrum offensive south in the Zaporizhzhia province, aiming roughly for the Sea of Azov. It's not that they needed to reach the sea itself. They just needed to get close enough that their artillery can target the trucks that are the primary supply line for equipment being shifted from Russia proper to the southern front in Kherson. Remember that the Kerch Strait bridge was blown up a couple of months ago, and because of that, the Russians can no longer use rail connections from Russia across the Kerch Strait and into the Crimean Peninsula. That option is gone, so everything has to be supplied by truck. The Russians don't have a lot of tactical military support trucks left, so their only option is to use basically city vans and Scooby-Doo vans and city buses in order to ferry artillery shells. And, every time you hit a speed bump, everyone's like, eh! And when those things go up, wow, they really go up. But if we are in the 30s in Ukraine for temperatures, mud season is getting a second lease on life here. And in that sort of environment, the Ukrainians can only operate on the roads. And that makes it much more difficult to do any sort of artillery or especially mobile warfare-based assault in Zaporizhzhia, because they can't push things into the fields and into the dirt. They have to stay on the roads or they get stuck in the mud. So this has provided a bit of an operational pause, which is really working against the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians don't have as much equipment and men as a rule than the Russians do. And if they can't fight a war of movement, then the Russians, with their better air force and especially their better missile forces, can just keep pounding Ukrainian cities over and over again, doing a lot of economic and humanitarian damage. And there's not a lot the Ukrainians can do about it in the short term if they can't operate. So for the Western Europeans and the Central Europeans, this has been a godsend. For the Ukrainians, they were probably those of you who have been following me for a while, you know that I am not very bullish on China. It's facing not demographic collapse, it's far faster than that, just complete demographic dissolution and economic collapse that goes along with that within the decade, assuming that there are no other problems. The United States has put in a series of technological restrictions that basically kill the entire tech sector. Their energy sector is completely dependent upon the ability to access the Middle East, which is an area they can't reach in force. Their trade system and their economic structures and their employment structures are utterly dependent upon the U.S. Navy making it safe for their civilian vessels to hit the world over. They are arguably the most internationally exposed country in the world, and on top of that, their financial sector and their agricultural sectors are absolute messes, things that make Enron look really well run. This is a country that is not going to last a whole lot longer. And in that environment, the question is, how do the Chinese prepare for the economic and if they want to politically continue? To this point, their solution has been absolutely rabid, foaming at the mouth nationalism, convincing their people that it doesn't matter if you can feed your kids, it doesn't matter if you have your job, you're Han Chinese and Chairman Xi is your leader, and that's enough. And to that end, Chinese propaganda has gone from the aggressive to the absolutely hateful. The person who has probably played the biggest role from an international point of view in this is a guy by the name of Zeihan, who has been the spokesman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he is kind of the poster child for what the Chinese call warrior wolf diplomacy, which is an unapologetic, ultra-nationalist, very hate and invective-filled approach to dealing with the rest of the world. So this is the guy who has popularized art that shows Australian soldiers with their knees on third world children. This is the guy who insists that COVID started at Fort Detrick in the United States and was then spread to the world as a way to wipe out non-white people, that sort of thing. He's a real piece of work, and he's a general asshat. Anyway, as long as he was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he was the voice of China on the international stage. Well, in the first week of January, he was transferred very quietly away from the MFA, and he is now a small wig at the Department of Ocean and Boundary Affairs, which is about like getting taken from being the spokesman of God, and all of a sudden now you're responsible for, what would be a great example here? You're in charge of Border Patrol in northern Idaho. It's difficult to imagine someone falling so far so fast. Now, the challenge we have in interpreting this is that no one really knows what Xi is thinking, because Xi is in such a tight cult of personality that he doesn't really confide in anyone, and it's very difficult for intel to penetrate that sort of environment. But we know that Zhao was one of Xi's favorites. And so for Xi to be not just demoted, but put into a complete cubbyhole in the middle of nowhere in terms of the bureaucracy is an indication that Xi knows that this strategy has utterly failed. There is no version of China that survives this unless it finds a way to work with the United States in a constructive way, and one that basically gives the United States everything from a strategic point of view that it wants. The United States is the only country that even theoretically has the tools that could help China survive what's coming. And having somebody whose job it is to throw gravel into the gears of the diplomatic relationship obviously is not helping at all. But to have him so dramatically demoted indicates that perhaps, just maybe, kind of, sorta, Xi is realizing that the end is approaching and he really needs to change diplomatic gears if there's any hope for China surviving the rest of this decade. So it's very perspective at this point. But if there was one person who needed to move in order to make a new approach happen, it was Zhao, and now he's gone. Okay, that's it from me. Until next time.